Lock down. Fucker.
The hand basin and small cupboard below. I saw long hair hanging out of the top of the cupboard, which was partially open.
Baby, come on. You can't sit sideways.
It seemed impossible that a person could get into such a small space. But without Purcell's having to say anything, a figure began to emerge from the tiny cupboard. After I recovered from the initial shock, I advised the subject to continue out and not make any false moves. As he emerged, he made a comment, more or less in a humorous vein, about being glad to get out of that cramped space. The subject was dressed entirely in buckskins, much differently than all the others we had found. I asked the subject who he was. He immediately replied Charlie Manson. He was taken to the back door and turned over to the officers outside.
Just put this bitch to bed
On
with the
re-entering
fucking
the house,
heavy foot.
Purcell found still
Making
another
me
man
fuck up
who
every
was
2
just
fucking
emerging from the
hours.
bedroom. He was David Lee Hammack,
Fucking sacred
a.k.a.
bed
Bill
that you
Vance,
must
an ex-con with
must
more
fucking
aliases
have.
than
Put me in this
Vance.
cold ass fucking living room.
Purcell noted the time, 6:40 p.m.
Fucking dad. Oh,
None of the
bitch.
suspects were
Off
armed,
me,
although several sheath knives were found on the kitchen table. The prisoners were handcuffed and, hands on heads, walked single file towards Sourdough Springs, where the officers had left 2 pickups. En route, they encountered 2 more females driving a car loaded with groceries. Also placed under arrest were Patty Sue Jarden, true name Catherine Gillies, and Sue Bartell, a.k.a. Country Sue. All the suspects were loaded in the back of 1 pickup, the second following immediately behind to provide illumination. As they neared the Lotus Mine area, about 3 miles from Barker, Manson told the officers that he had left his pack there, near the side of the road. Purcell. He asked us to stop and pick it up, which we agreed to do. However, we could not locate it by his directions, and we refused to let him loose to search himself as he requested. On the way to Independence, Manson told Purcell and Ward that the blacks were going to take over the country, and that he and his group only wanted to find a quiet, peaceful place away from the conflict. But the establishment, as represented by the police, wouldn't let them alone. He also told them that they, being both cops and white, were in deep trouble, and should escape to the desert or somewhere while they still had the chance. Also during the ride, again according to Purcell, 2 things happened which indicated to me the leadership exerted over the group by Subject Manson. At least twice Charlie made statements that would cause the others to say amen 2 or 3 times in unison. Also, a few times when the others would become involved in whispered, giggly conversations, Charlie would simply look at them and immediately they would fall silent. The amazing part of the stare, Purcell noted, was how obvious the results were without a word being spoken. On arriving in Independence, the suspects were charged with grand theft auto, arson, and various other offenses. The leader of the family was fingerprinted, photographed, and booked as Manson Charles M., a.k.a. Jesus Christ, God. According to Frank Bowles, although all but 3 of the 11 vehicles recovered were stolen, there was insufficient evidence to link most of the group with the thefts, and after a few days, more than half of those arrested were released. Though most had left the area, 2 of the girls, Squeaky and Sandy, had rented a motel room and were staying in Independence so they could run errands for Manson and the others still in custody. I I asked Foles if he knew why the group had come to the area in the first place. He told me that one of the girls, Kathy Gillies, was the granddaughter of the woman who owned Myers Ranch. The family had apparently camped there first, then moved to nearby Barker. After the raid, a sheriff's deputy interviewed Mrs. Arlene Barker, who was living at Indian Ranch in the Panamint Valley. She told him that about a year ago, Manson had visited her, asking permission to camp at Barker Ranch. Like George Spahn, Mrs. Barker presumed there were only a few people and that they intended to stay only a few days. On this visit, Manson gave her a gold record, which had been presented to the Beach Boys, commemorating $1 million in sales of their LP, The Beach Boys Today. Manson told her that he was the composer or arranger for the group. Manson had contacted her again, 2 or 3 weeks before the October raid, wanting to buy Barker Ranch. She told him she wanted cash. Manson said he'd see her again when he had it. Apparently, Manson felt that if he actually owned the property, he would have fewer problems with local law enforcement agencies. I was unaware until much later that Manson supposedly had an alternate plan to get control of Myers Ranch, which called for murdering Kathy's grandmother, and that the plan had been frustrated by something very simple and commonplace. While en route to her home, the 3 killers he'd chosen had a flat tire. I asked Foles about the evidence recovered in the raids and subsequent searches. Were any of the knives Buck brand? Yes, several. Any rope? No. What about wire cutters? Yes, there was a big red pair. They found them in the back of what they later learned was Manson's personal or command dune buggy. Aside from the Ruger 22 and Clem shotgun, any other firearms? Not one, Foles said. In none of the searches did the officers turn up the machine guns, shotguns, rifles, pistols, and large stores of ammunition Crockett, Poston, and others said the family had. Throughout the trials that followed, we would remain very aware that those members of the family still at large probably had access to a sizable cache of arms and ammunition. Barker Ranch was located in Goler Wash, one of 7 dry washes in the Panamint Range, approximately 22 miles southeast of Ballarat. He had been all over the country, Foles told me. Those dry washes comprised the roughest terrain he had ever seen. We'd have to walk much of it, he said. Otherwise, our heads would bounce through the roof of the 4-wheel drive Jeep Foles had chosen for the trip. Ah, come on, Frank, I said. It can't be that rough. It was. The washes were extremely narrow and rock-strewn. Going up them, we'd frequently gain 1 foot, then with an angry screech of rubber slide back 2. You could smell the tires burning. Finally, Foles and I got out of the vehicle and walked in front of it, removing boulders as McGann drove forward foot after foot. It took us 2 hours to travel 5 miles. I asked Foles to have photographs taken of the washes. I wanted to show the jury how isolated and remote an area the killers had chosen for their hiding place. Circumstantial evidence, a tiny speck, but of such specks, one after another, are strong cases made. No one would have chosen to live at either Barker or Myers Ranch, which were about a quarter of a mile apart, except for one thing. There was water. There was even a swimming pool at Barker, though like the stone ranch house and outlying shacks, it was in disrepair. The house was small: living room, bedroom, kitchen, bathroom. I also wanted photos of the cabinet under the sink where Manson hid. It measured 3 by 1 1/2 by 1 1/2 feet. I could see why Purcell was so surprised. When I saw the large school bus, I couldn't believe Manson had brought it up one of the washes. He hadn't, Foles told me. He'd driven it in over the road on the Las Vegas side. Even that had been an ordeal, and the condition of the bus showed it. It was a battered green and white. On the side was an American flag decal with the slogan, "America, love it or leave it." While Sartucci and the others searched the house, I went to work on the abandoned bus. The placement of the warrant took some thought. It had to be left in sight. However, if it was, anyone could come along and remove it. I didn't want a defense attorney contending we hadn't fulfilled the requirements of the search. I put it on one of the racks just under the roof of the bus. You could see it if you looked up. At least a foot of clothing was piled on the floor. I later learned that wherever the family stayed, they kept a community clothing pile. When an item was needed, they'd root through the pile until they found it. I got down on my hands and knees and began rooting too. I was looking for two things in particular: clothing with bloodstains and boots. A bloody boot-heel print had been found on the front porch of the Tate residence. There was a small mark, a little indentation in the heel, that I was hoping we could match up. Although I found several boots, none had such a mark. And when Joe Granado applied the benzidine test to the clothing, the results were uniformly negative. I had all the clothing taken back to LA anyway, hoping SID might come up with something in the lab. There were 8 to 10 magazines in the bus, half of which were National Geographics. Looking through them, I noticed something curious. All dated from 1939 to 1945, and all had articles on Hitler. One also had photographs of Rommel and his Desert Corps. But that was about all we found. Our search appeared to have yielded little, if anything, of evidentiary value. However, I was anxious to go through the items picked up in the raids. On the way back to Independence, we stopped in Lone Pine. While I was nursing a beer with the officers, Sartucci remarked that he and Patchett had interviewed Manson in Independence some weeks earlier, questioning him about the Tate as well as the LaBianca murders. The following day, when I called Lieutenant Helder, I mentioned this, thinking he probably had a report on the interview. Helder was amazed. He had no idea anyone from LAPD had ever talked to Manson. This was my first indication that the Tate and LaBianca detectives hadn't exactly been working hand in glove. Helder did have some news. It wasn't good. Sergeant Lee had run a ballistics comparison on the .22 caliber bullets we found at Spawn. All were negative to those recovered at 10,050 Shallow Drive. I wasn't about to give up that easily. I still wanted a much more thorough search of Spawn Ranch. We stayed at the Winneduma again that night. Up early the next morning, I walked to the courthouse. I'd forgotten what fresh air smelled like. That trees, grass, have scents. In LA, there are no smells, just smog. A couple of blocks from the courthouse, I saw 2 young girls, one carrying a baby. It was a wild guess, but I asked, "Are you Sandy and Squeaky?" They admitted they were. I identified myself and said that I would like to talk to them in the district attorney's office at 1 p.m. They said they would come if I would buy them some candy. I said I would. In the DA's office, Olds opened his files and gave me everything he had on the Manson family. Sartucci set to work photocopying. In going through the documents, I spotted a reference to Crockett and Poston. Inyo County Deputy Sheriff Don Ward talked to the 2 miners in Shoshone and has their entire conversation recorded. I wanted to interview the pair, but it would save time if I heard the tape first, so I asked McGann to contact Ward and get it for me. There was also an October 2nd, 1969 California Highway Patrol report, in which it was stated, Deputy Dennis Cox has FIR card on suspect Charles Montgomery, 23 years of age, date of birth 12/2/45. Field interrogation reports are 3x5 cards that are made whenever a person is stopped and questioned. I wanted to see that card. We still knew very little about Tex, who hadn't been arrested in either the Spawn or Barker raids. After going through the large stack of documents, I started on the evidence seized in the October 10th to 12th raid. I had Granado test the knives for blood. Negative. The wire cutters were large and heavy. It would have been difficult to shinny up a telephone pole with them. Still, maybe they were the only pair available. I gave them to the officers so SID could make comparison cuts on the Tate telephone wires. Boots, but no discernible heel mark. I put them aside for SID. I checked the labels on all the clothing, noting that a number of the women's garments, though now filthy, came from expensive shops. I had them taken to LA for analysis. I also wanted Winifred Chapman and Susan Struthers to look at them, to see if any of the items might have been the property of Sharon Tate, Abigail Folger, or Rosemary LaBianca. Squeaky and Sandy kept the appointment. I'd done a little checking before talking to them. Though the information was sketchy, I knew that both had been born in Southern California and had come from fairly well-to-do families. Squeaky's parents lived in Santa Monica, Her father was an aeronautical engineer. Sandy's parents had divorced and remarried. Her father was a San Diego stockbroker. According to DiCarlo, when Sandy joined the family, sometime early in 1968, she had some $6,000 in stocks, which she sold, giving the money to Manson. She and her baby were now on welfare. Both girls had started college, then dropped out. Squeaky attending El Camino Junior College in Torrance, Sandy the University of Oregon and San Francisco State. Squeaky had been one of the earliest members of the family, I later learned, casting her lot with Manson just months after he got out of prison in 1967. They were the first family members I had talked to, other than DiCarlo, who was a fringe member at best, and I was immediately struck by their expressions. They seemed to radiate inner contentment. I'd seen others like this, true believers, religious fanatics, yet I was both shocked and impressed. Nothing seemed to faze them. They smiled almost continuously, no matter what was said. For them, all the questions had been answered. There was no need to search anymore, because they had found the truth. And their truth was, Charlie is love.
Fucking do it. Shut up.
Tell me about this love, I asked them. Do you mean this in the male-female sense? Yes, that too, they answered. But that was only...
Baby house. Bunch of baby dicks. Yeah, I don't fucking think so, bro.
apart. More all-encompassing? Yes, but love is love. You can't define it. Did Charlie teach you this? I asked, genuinely curious. Charlie did not need to teach them, they said. Charlie only turned them around so they could look at themselves and see the love within. Did they believe that Charlie was Jesus Christ?
So fucking sick of these.
They only smiled enigmatically, as if sharing a secret no one else could possibly understand. Although Squeaky was 21 and Sandy 25, there was a little girl quality to them, as if they hadn't aged but had been retarded at a certain stage in their childhood. Little girls playing little girl games. Including murder? I wondered. Is your love for Charlie, say, different from your love for George Spahn? I asked Squeaky. No, love is love, Squeaky said. It's all the same. But she'd hesitated just a moment before answering, giving the impression that, though these were the words she was supposed to say, there was heresy in them, in denying that Charlie was special. Perhaps to overcome this, she told me about her relationship with George Spahn. She was in love with George, Squeaky said. If he asked her to marry him, she would. George was, she went on, a beautiful person inside. He was also, she added, in an obvious attempt to shock me, very good in bed. She was quite graphic.
He's 80 years old.
I'm not that interested in your sex life, Squeaky, I told her. But I am very, very interested in what you know about the Tate, LaBianca, Hinman, and other murders. Neither expression changed in the slightest. The smiles remained. They knew nothing about any crimes. All they knew about was love. I talked to them for a long time, asking specific questions now, but still getting pat answers. On asking where they were on a certain date, for example, they'd reply, "There is no such thing as time." The answers were both non-responsive and a guard. I wanted to get past that guard, to learn what they really felt. I couldn't. I sensed something else. Each was, in her own way, a pretty girl. But there was a sameness about them that was much stronger than their individuality. I noticed it again, later that afternoon, in talking to other female members of the family. Same expressions, same patterned responses, same tone of voice, same lack of distinct personality. The realization came with a shock. They reminded me less of human beings than Barbie dolls. Looking at Sandy's almost beatific smile, I remembered something that Frank Foles had told me. and a chill ran up and down my spine. While she was still in jail in Independence, Sandy had been overheard talking to one of the other girls in the family. Sandy had told her, "I finally reached the point where I can kill my parents." Leslie, Weish, Snake, Brenda, Gypsy. Frank Foles arranged to have them brought over from the jail, where they were still being held on charges stemming from the Barker raid. Like Squeaky and Sandy, they accepted my bribe, candy and gum, and told me nothing of importance. Their answers were as if rehearsed. Often they gave identical responses. If we were to get any of them to talk, I knew we would have to separate them. There was a cohesion, a kind of cement that held them together. A part of it was undoubtedly their strange, and to me still puzzling, relationship with Charles Manson. Part was their shared experiences, the world known as the family. But I couldn't help wondering if another of the ingredients wasn't fear. Fear of what the others would say if they talked. Fear of what the others would do. The only way we could find out would be to keep them apart. And owing to the smallness of the jail, it couldn't be done in Independence. Besides Manson, there was only one male family member still in custody. Clem Tufts, true name Steve Grogan. Jack Gardner, Foles investigator, gave me the 18-year-old Grogan's rap sheet. 3/23/66, possession dangerous drugs, 6 months probation. 4/27/66, shoplifting, continued on probation. 6/23/66, disturbing the peace, continued on probation. 9/27/66, probation dismissed. 6/5/67, possession marijuana, counseled and released. 8/12/67, shoplifting, bail forfeiture. 1/22/68, loitering, closed after investigation. 4/5/69, grand theft money and prowling, released insufficient evidence. 5/20/69, grand theft auto, released insufficient evidence. 6/11/69, child molesting and indecent exposure. Grogan had been observed exposing himself to several children, ages 4 to 5 years. The kids wanted me to, he explained to arresting officers who had caught him in the act. I violated the law. The thing fell out of my pants and the parents got excited, he later told a court-appointed psychiatrist. After interviewing Grogan, the psychiatrist ruled against committing him to Camarillo State Hospital because the minor is much too aggressive to remain in a setting which does not provide containment facilities.
4 and 5 years old.
The court decided otherwise, sending him to Camarillo for a 90-day observation period. He remained a grand total of 2 days, then walked away, aided, I would later learn, by one of the girls from the family. His escape had occurred on July 19, 1969. He was back at Spawn in time for the Hinman, Tate, and LaBianca murders. He was arrested in the August 16th Spawn raid, but was released 2 days later, in time to behead Shorty Shea.
Come on, baby.
Currently, as a result of the Barker raid, he was charged with grand theft auto and possession of an illegal weapon, that is, the sawed-off shotgun. I asked Foles the present status of the case. He said that at the instigation of Grogan's attorney, he had been examined by 2 psychiatrists who had decided that he was presently insane.
Baby.
I told Foles I hoped he would request a jury trial and fight the insanity plea. If I brought Clem to trial in Los Angeles, charged with participating in the Tate murders, I didn't want the defense introducing evidence that a court in Inyo County had already found him insane. Frank agreed to go along with this. At the moment, our case against Grogan was so thin as to be non-existent. There was no proof that Donald Shorty Shea was even dead. To date, no body had been found. As for the Tate murders, all we had was DeCarlo's statement